The German Democratic Republic, formerly East Germany, was a totalitarian dictatorship. It was far behind the West in terms of what its economy had to offer to its citizens. People had to wait in line for almost everything. Compared to the West, they had terrible stores, terrible housing, and worst of all, terrible cars. But there is one area in which they were better than almost anybody else at that time, and that is shipbuilding. Big or small, their boats were so well built that to this day they remain a common sight on the German waterways. And that's what I got right here. Built just a few months before the fall of the Berlin Wall, this so-called Ibis II remains one of the best second-hand boats you can find on the local market. It has a very generous interior space and was built like a tank, and therefore can handle engines far beyond the rated 9 kilowatts or about 12 horsepower. One interesting fact is that the windshield comes straight from the famous Trabant car. The only issue I got with it is that they put the steering wheel on the wrong side, but we'll get to that later. And yes, I know, I should focus on finishing the bathroom on my steel yacht before starting any other new projects. And by the way, what about that other huge boat that I just bought? But I promise that I would only start working on the Ibis after I finished my shift on the steel yacht. Because the reality is that working on the steel yacht is currently so exhausting that working on this much smaller boat feels almost like a holiday and gives me the opportunity to relax while still remaining productive. And so in the long run, I think it's beneficial to all my projects as a whole. Plus, my friends, let's be real. Every once in a while, you have to live a little. I'll start by having a look at the 30 horsepower Mercury Mariner 2-stroke engine. Because I bought this boat sight unseen, so at this point I'm not sure if it's actually working. I had to find a container that could envelop the entire lower part of the drive shaft while still being able to have the propeller rotate freely. Here's the gasoline tank and a 12-volt battery, and then it was time to start it up for the first time. For whatever reason, it wouldn't start up, so I thought I'd first check the spark plugs. Both turned out to be in good condition, so I put them back and tried again. And after trying several more times, I suddenly realized that the ignition key needs to remain in the on position for the motor to run. Quite embarrassing actually. Good thing nobody saw this. With the engine running, we can now move on to other things. First, I'll take care of this conceptual mistake of having the steering wheel on the port side, which is not actually the problem. The problem is having to operate the gear and shift control with your left hand. I need to use a puller to get the steering wheel out of the way. Now I can remove the gearbox from the steering system. Next I have to remove the steering rod from the motor so that I can later put it back the other way around. And please note that this video doesn't follow the strict chronological order in which I did things, simply because the amount of different elements I had to take care of, so you might see things appear and disappear at different stages, which might not make sense at that time, but at least now you know why. I'll quickly remove all those junk buttons. Next it's time to determine the new position for the steering system's gearbox. And then comes the gruesome task of cutting open the dashboard for the gearbox to fit. Next I'll attach the steering rod back to the motor. For that I'll lube it up with some boat grease. Let's see if it works. Perfect. Next, I'll move the throttle control box to the other side, and here I'm doing something totally unnecessary, as you will see in a moment. Because I didn't know at that time that the lever on the throttle control box can be moved to the other side, I made these spacers out of wood. And since it's working just fine, I'm gonna leave it like that as a constant reminder for my lack of knowledge. Alright, now let's put the steering wheel back, and then we'll do a little test on land to see if everything works so far. And at this point, I would like to tell you that due to a lack of time and financial resources, I don't plan to make a full refit of this boat, but just focus on the most necessary to get it fully operational and safe for this season. Everything seems to be working fine, so let's move on. I'm gonna make a wooden panel for the dashboard, for one to make it look good, for another to give it back some strength. To get the curve right, I took measurements at different points, which I can then transfer onto the wood. Then I take a curved wooden plate to draw a nice, natural looking curve. After cutting out the shape, I used the orbital sander to soften up the edges. Next, I mark the position for the bolts, with which I'm gonna attach the wooden panel to the fiberglass. Then I drill set holes. I countersink the holes. I'm gonna put in a couple of bolts to keep the wooden panel in place. With the plate firmly secured, I drill the remaining holes. Next, I have to make a hole for the steering system's gearbox. Here, I have to carve out some indentations for the plate that secures the steering system's gearbox. Now that all the holes are drilled, I can sand this down, countersink the remaining holes, and then move on to painting. First, I put down a couple layers of boat lacquer with a brush. I then sand this down once again before applying a final coat with my spray paint gun. In this way, I hope to achieve a very smooth and even final layer of boat lacquer. After putting the dashboard panel back in place, I mark the position for the new switch panel. Next, I drill 4 holes to mark the position for the cutout onto the fiberglass. Then I cut a square hole first into the wood and then into the fiberglass. With the switch panel in place, I can attach the dashboard panel firmly onto the fiberglass of the boat. Next, let's deal with the electronics. I'm first gonna remove all of the old cables, then I'm gonna tidy up the remaining ones. For my DC distribution, I'm gonna use a small battery switch with a tiny fuse box, as well as a bus bar for the negative distribution. Now I just have to find a suitable spot where to install them, so I found this little ring here behind the dashboard. Next I'm gonna prepare a wooden plate, which is going to hold the electronic devices. After making sure that it fits very tightly, I cover the board with a thin layer of boat lacquer and then screw the electronic devices onto it. I then connect the first wires. I then put everything in place, securing it with a small screw at the bottom. I got a small battery dedicated to everything other than the motor, and a tiny solar panel to charge the battery. Eventually, I wired everything up and made the cables as neat and tidy as possible. Alright, now let's install the loads. First the navigation lights. Here I'm simply gonna install a new light, even though the boat already has the red and green navigation lights. But I just don't want to bother with having to find the right light bulbs and wiring up two separate lights instead of a single one. Here at the rear I'm going to install a stern/anchor light. First I need to remove the old fixture. I'm gonna reuse this little aluminum stand and bolt it onto the rear of the boat. I'm gonna use a leftover piece of teak wood to serve as a tiny mast for the anchor light. Finally, I'm gonna install a bilge pump. After trimming the hose to the right length, I'm gonna install a through hull above the waterline. I'm gonna use this leftover piece of aluminum to make a bracket for attaching the bilge pump. During this process I realized that I urgently need a bigger vise, but in the end it worked out with the help of hammers and pliers. With this I can now attach the bilge pump firmly to the new floorboard, which I'm gonna show you in a moment. Now with all the loads wired up, I can go ahead and label the switches. Next I'm gonna show you how I made a wooden floorboard to put on top of the fiberglass floor. As always, it all starts with taking precise measurements. In order to get the curve right, I'm measuring the width at 30 centimeters intervals. Next I transfer these measurements onto the wood and then cut it out. A first test fitting reveals that I was spot on with my measurements. And so I can proceed with cleaning up the edges and then seal them with multiple layers of boat lacquer to prevent water from soaking into the wood. Next I'm gonna build a simple backrest for the rear passengers. For this I'm gonna use the same 28mm plywood plate. I round off the corners at the top. I then once again clean the edges and seal them with boat lacquer. These large hinges, initially meant to be used for a wooden gate or something, will serve as brackets for the backrest. After finding the right position, I drill some holes into the fiberglass and screw down the backrest. I'm gonna install an M6 bolt to attach a chain which is gonna hold the backrest in the right position. These chains turned out to be super noisy, so I replaced them with a steel rope. Next I'm gonna install the front seats. I'm gonna use these pedestals. And once again, after finding the right position, I screw them firmly onto the floorboard. Next I'm gonna redo the paint below the waterline. The old paint, while not in a great condition, at least doesn't peel off, and it doesn't seem like the boat was stored in the water for extended periods of time. So in preparation for painting, I'm just gonna do a quick round of sanding to remove any dirt and roughen up the surface a little. I then put down a couple of coats of primer. Next I'm gonna apply the anti-fouling, for which I'm using a hard anti-fouling. Just like before, I first use a roll to cover the large surfaces, then later I use a thin brush to focus on the details where the roll couldn't reach. After 2 coats, I can strip away the tape and then we can have a look at the result. Overall, the anti-fouling is covering nicely all the surfaces, despite only applying 2 layers. Certainly, a 3rd and a 4th layer would have been advisable, but I simply ran out of time. Plus, like I said in the beginning, I'm only doing the most necessary for a single season. And so, Ella is now ready to go into the water. So I brought her to my favorite boat ramp, where I can demonstrate to you my favorite way to get the boat into the water. After blocking the wheels and removing the taillight from the trailer, I detach the trailer from the car and move the car forward. Next I use a long, thick rope to tie up the trailer back to the car. I then move forward a little, remove the wooden blocks, and then back down slowly towards the water while a friend is keeping the trailer aligned with the ramp. I removed the last tension strap at the last moment before lowering the boat into the water. And of course a rope with sufficient length has already been installed at the boat beforehand. And so that concludes the story of my new little fun boat, which I refitted with very limited resources in terms of time and money, and I hope you agree that it was totally worth it. Now I don't want to make any promises, but I think that I'm gonna take it back out of the water at the end of this season and then do a full refit during the coming winter. And so now, let's take her for a spin. The boat is of course great for cruising, but with that 2-stroke engine, its true potential is revealed once you put the throttle lever all the way down to the fiberglass. So yeah, let me know what you think of it, and I'll see you in the next video.